Okay, so now we made it to chapter 6, and we're going to be talking about unit testing in Java. So let's get into it. Okay, now let's get into the curriculum. 6.1, Testing in Java. You've already recognized the importance of testing your code. Automated testing in Java, like any language, ensures that your code works as expected. Every time it runs, tests also function as documentation. All right, let me explain, and we're going to go over it in a second here when we talk about documentation. What we mean here is when you write your code, up until this point, you may use comments to write comments on what you were doing on a particular method. But that's okay to kind of tell your future self, or maybe documenting inside of the program to show another developer what you were thinking. But it's not always the best practice, because what happens is when you write those comments, and if you change anything inside your method, most of the time no one updates the comments. So for instance, if I write that code or that method, and then I send it over to another developer and they decided to change some type of outcome or what the output is going to be, now they don't update the documentation. Now it goes to another developer, or it comes back to me, and I'm looking at the notes trying to figure out, okay, what was the thought process for this method? And I go ahead and think that this method is supposed to have a certain outcome, but it doesn't. What a unit test does by self-documenting it, whenever you change anything in that method that it doesn't give it the correct output, it's going to fail. So you are forced to update the documentation of a method or a test if you decide to change the output. That's why unit tests are so important. So let's get back to the curriculum. Giving an observer instructions on how to properly execute your classes and methods. This course covers unit testing in Java with a test runner called JUnit 4. Unit testing breaks down the code base into its smallest building blocks, which are individual statements and methods. Here's a tip. If you're not yet familiar with the benefits of automated testing, you can familiarize yourself here. Go ahead and click that link right here, and it'll give you a little bit more information. In 6.1.1, why we test. 6.1.1.1, refactoring. Because they work on the most basic functionality of your code, unit tests safeguard against bugs introduced in refactoring. Refactoring refers to the purpose of rewriting code without adding new features. Imagine this common workflow. 1. You practice TDD, which means test-driven development, writing your test to stipulate your class code. 2. You write your code to pass your test. 3. Later, a stakeholder in your project requests that you refactor your code using different syntax. Now, what does refactoring mean? Let's kind of talk about that for a second. The purpose of refactoring your code is maybe for writing it in a different way or using a different syntax, but also to make the code more efficient. But you still want to have the same outcome. And that's why you write the unit test. The unit test is about getting the same outcome, the same feature. You can write it different ways to make it more efficient, but it still has to have the same result. Okay? Now, the features will be the same, but the implementation changes. Unit tests help in this scenario in that changes to implementation should not require changes to outcome. Thus, if your test can continue past after the refactor, you can move on. However, you have not inadvertently introduced a bug. When you write tests once, they provide a code lifetime worth of benefits. 6.1.1.2 Documentation. Unit tests are the most enlightened form of documentation. Again, because they address the most fundamental tasks of your classes. Unit tests serve as live code use cases. You may also have an external documentation directory with examples of how to run your project. Or perhaps you have been writing comments within your code to best communicate with your teammates about your changes. Now, understand something about writing code or comments in your code. That is not the best practice when you're dealing with an enterprising app. Why? Because it still takes up space. So you don't want to write a lot of comments in your code. You want to put those comments maybe in a documentation, or you want to have self-documenting code unit tests to help with whatever methods. Now, each time you update your code, you might remember to update the documentation and comments. With unit tests, however, you have a more obvious reminder that a change has been made if a test failed. 6.1.2 Testing Best Practices. Below are some best practices to keep in mind when writing unit tests in any language. 1. These are, remember, this is what we call a pattern, and we call this pattern the triple A's. The triple A's of unit test refers to the pattern to follow when writing your unit test. A. Arrange variables your tests require. B. Act on the methods your tests require. And C. Assert the anticipated comparison of the expected and actual values. And we'll go a little bit more over assert later. 2. Deterministic. Every single solitary time a test is run, it should produce the same outcome. A test that passes only most of the time is a worthless test. 3. Relevant. Tests as they are written should be grouped by related classes and function. 4. Meaningful. There is no need to test trivial code. For example, unless they contain additional functionality, there is no need to write tests for getters and setters. Your IntelliJ IDE offers code completion for these anyway. Now check your understanding. Okay, we've made it to the end of this section. Now we're going to go into the next section on the JUnit part. I hope you learned a little bit here. Go back and look at that link. Go back over this section if it doesn't make sense. Do a little research on refactoring your code and understanding the best practices of the AAA. There's documentation on that pattern. So remember, the more you practice, the more you improve. Okay, see you in the next video.